battle to build big. Ships that are taller than 23-story buildings, nearly 4 football fields in length, and too wide to fit through the Panama Canal. Cruise lines are stretching technology to its limits in a race to dwarf the competition with the ultimate super ship. November 1999, just off Florida's east coast, and maritime history is being made. Arriving at her home port of Miami for the very first time is the largest passenger vessel ever. She's called Voyager of the Seas. She's just sailed here from Finland, the country where she was built. After her epic maiden voyage across the North Atlantic, this is a nervous moment for ship's captain Svein Pedersen, as he comes to grips with the ship's brand new steering and navigation systems to negotiate the giant's way through the narrow shipping channels into her berth. Voyager of the Seas is a descendant of the great passenger liners like the Titanic, the Queen Mary, and the QE2. And Voyager is the 21st century's equivalent. Her voyage has followed in the footsteps of the famous old transatlantic liners. But that's where the similarities end. Because the $450 million spent on making her the biggest ever has not produced a ship intended for long ocean voyages. She is designed for a more basic purpose.
The pizza's good.
Everything is nice and clean.
We're going to have a wonderful time in this boat. We're going to make it rock.
It's definitely a place to party.
And a lot of pleasures to be derived, I'm sure.
As a cruise ship, Voyager is built for pleasure. But she's a pleasure cruiser built on an unprecedented scale. In fact, it's hard to grasp how big she is. So compare her to the Empire State Building. By placing the ship on one end, it's easy to see she rises to stand shoulder to shoulder with one of the tallest buildings on Earth. The Empire State overlooks New York's harbor, and it was here that the great liners ended their transatlantic crossings. But Voyager dwarfs these giants. She's twice the size of the QE2 and over 3 times bigger than the Titanic. Her immensity hits everyone the moment they join the ship.
It's awfully big. It's huge. I love it.
It takes your breath away.
It shouldn't be floating on water.
Awesome. That's all I can say. Just awesome.
Confusing. I got a little lost. We needed directions to find this place.
So big and so awesome.
We're just checking out the whole ship. How'd it take to Wednesday?
For Royal Caribbean Cruises, who commissioned Voyager, building bigger than anyone else is the ultimate expression of their commercial goals in a cutthroat business. They want to win the battle of the big boats, the front line of which is the port of Miami. More than 3 million passengers a year come to Miami to join cruise ships bound for the Caribbean. Passenger numbers have more than doubled in the last decade. The business is now worth over $7 billion a year. Industry insider Tom Steighorst has witnessed the gold rush for the cruise industry in the 1990s and the growth of intense rivalry between Royal Caribbean and their main competitor, Carnival Cruises.
Royal Caribbean considers itself a little bit classier cruise line, maybe. Carnival would say we have everything that Royal Caribbean has, only we might be a little bit cheaper.
Voyager of the Seas is merely the latest salvo in the war between them. For a decade, competition has driven a sort of cruise liner arms race as bigger and bigger ships get built, fueling the one-upmanship. Capturing new passengers and pushing up profits drives this competition. But that's not all.
Ego has quite a substantial role to play in this. Anybody who's building ships this big is going to see themselves reflected in the wake of those ships. And they want to make sure that these ships are everything that they've promised the public that they're going to be.
And that's why Voyager's so big. As well as being over 1,000 feet long, she's as wide as an 8-lane highway and taller than a 23-story office building. She's more theme park than cruise ship. Voyager has a 3-story dining room with a design inspired by the movie Titanic. It has a theater big enough to grace Broadway. That's not to mention the full-size ice rink, 5 swimming pools, 15 bars and 11 restaurants, 1,100 crew members, and over 3,000 passengers. The hard sell also emphasizes the outdoor facilities. A golf course, a basketball court, and even a rock climbing wall. Inside, the focal point of the ship is the Royal Promenade, a 4-story high mall running the length of 2 football fields down the core of the ship. It features boutiques, bars, and a huge casino, which includes the world's biggest slot machine. But cutthroat competition also means building Voyager has been a race against the clock, a race that has pushed the limits of shipbuilding. Naval architects had barely 2 years to smelt, shape, and assemble 300,000 steel plates to make the ship's mega hull. Compared to the ships of the past, Voyager's a quantum leap forward, and for Hari Kulavara, who spent most of his career building ferries, it has been a journey into the unknown.
We had here special challenges. This ship was 80% bigger than what Royal Caribbean had ever built in the past. So everything was close to double or even more than double than what we had used to handle. And what we found out clearly here is that when the ship size is doubling, some of the problems grow. So it was a huge challenge.
It was a challenge that began far away from the sunshine of Miami on the fringes of the Arctic Circle. In Hari's homeland of Finland, blizzards blow off the frozen Baltic Ocean. Here, ice meets fire. And in this inferno, the steel that would become Voyager was forged. This would be one of the most critical phases in the entire process. Months before construction began, it was crucial to get the mix of elements in the steel exactly right. Hidden dangers lurk in the presence of certain trace elements, which can fatally weaken the metal and make the difference between life and death for passengers. The heavy responsibility of seeking out these risky trace elements is the job of metallurgist Salla Sandström.
Because it's silicon, manganese, and different impurities like phosphor and sulfur. And we have very strict limits to these elements.
Fractions of a percent can affect the strength of the steel, so the cocktail of chemicals must be in exactly the right balance, especially trace elements like sulfur and phosphorus. If it's wrong, Salla might reject the whole batch.
These are very important because all the properties of the steel, strength, toughness, and weldability, are depending what the chemical composition is. The most important elements then are carbon and manganese. When we talk about toughness, this kind of impurities like phosphorus and sulfur are very bad for steel toughness.
And compromising steel toughness can have devastating effects. Strewn across the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, this twisted wreckage is what remains of the RMS Titanic. In 1912, she had been the biggest cruise ship the world had ever seen. But after scraping against an iceberg, she sank in less than 3 hours. After the wreck was discovered in 1985, metallurgists analyzed samples from the hull to better understand the disaster. Although the Titanic was made of good quality steel for her time, the tests revealed the chemical composition had high concentrations of sulfur and phosphorus, elements we now know can weaken the steel. These impurities would have compromised the ability to withstand impacts and could have made any collision devastating. This insight into the Titanic tragedy only emphasized Stella Sandström's desire to make sure the steel Voyager was about to be built from should be smelted to the most exacting standards if the new giant wasn't to be another disaster in the making. During 1997, Rautaruukki smelted thousands of tons of thin steel plate. Project Voyager had overcome its first hurdle, but the next one was just as challenging. How to turn the raw materials into a structure capable of surviving the awesome power of the sea.
This TLC program is sponsored in part by Lending.
Like a building, Voyager has to support her own massive weight. But buildings don't sit on a moving ocean. Most significantly, Voyager's hull is so long it would bend as she moved through the waves.
Steel is elastic and should be elastic also. And the ship's hull is hugging and sagging like that when it goes through the waves. And a hull like this cannot crack. You cannot accept cracks, because if you get the crack which starts to develop during the voyage, you might get into trouble.
To avoid trouble, Voyager must cope with the sort of bend that this ship has to endure. She's the longest ever built, and she's called the Yara Viking.
To take a Yara Viking helicopter. I am en route to your vessel, and we have your permission to land.
Yes, sir, this is the Yara Viking helicopter. This is the Yara Viking. Go ahead, sir.
Yara Viking carries 4 million barrels of crude oil worth $120 million from the Arabian Gulf to the Gulf of Mexico in a hull less than 2 inches thick.
Please come to 020.
020, sir.
When she comes on that, please let me know.
She's the longest floating object on Earth. She is 1,504 feet long, yet is sailed by a crew of only 40 people. Twice as heavy as Voyager, it takes 3 miles for the ship to come to a halt, even after her engines have been stopped.
This ship, from full head to full stern, she will move almost about 5 kilometers before she stops, and that's about 33 minutes. So if you have a small island, you can run over it.
This supergiant is so long, her hull bends by as much as 1.6 feet as she plows over the waves. The heavier the seas, the worse the bending.
In moderate to heavy sea, she flexes a lot. I've heard of people leaving the vessel. From midship to forward, you'll find the bows moving up and down.
A battle to build big. Ships that are taller than 23-story buildings. nearly 4 football fields in length, and too wide to fit through the Panama Canal. Cruise lines are stretching technology to its limits in a race to dwarf the competition with the ultimate super ship. November 1999, just off Florida's east coast, and maritime history is being made. Arriving at her home port of Miami for the very first time is the largest passenger vessel ever. She's called Voyager of the Seas. She's just sailed here from Finland, the country where she was built. After her epic maiden voyage across the North Atlantic, this is a nervous moment for ship's captain Svein Pedersen, as he comes to grips with the ship's brand new steering and navigation systems to negotiate the giant's way through the narrow shipping channels into her berth. Voyager of the Seas is a descendant of the great passenger liners like the Titanic, the Queen Mary, and the QE2. And Voyager is the 21st century's equivalent. Her voyage has followed in the footsteps of the famous old transatlantic liners. But that's where the similarities end. Because the $450 million spent on making her this was vital. To make their delivery date, they had less than 2 years to build her.
So the hull was divided into two big sections, big modules, which can weigh up to about 800 tons altogether. They were the biggest pieces. Full width of the ship, maybe 3 or 4 deck heights high, and maybe about 10-15 meter long.
Construction began in September 1997. They had just 6 months to get enough modules ready to begin main assembly. Never before had the Massa shipyard had to manufacture and fit together so many parts. The challenge was to make sure each piece fit with the next exactly, meaning the size of even the smallest component had to be cut incredibly accurately. This couldn't be done by human hand. People, no matter how skilled, cannot achieve these kinds of tolerances.
We have tolerance in fabrication of plus minus 2 millimeters. So every steel part what we are making is within that tolerance.
So everything was handled by computer-controlled plasma cutters. The flame burns underwater at over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. It makes its own gas bubble. Cutting underwater keeps the metal cool. It reduces the possibility that its molecular structure will be weakened by intense heating, which would undo Salle Sandström's work back at the steel mill. Finally, in March 1998, the first hull section was lifted into the dry dock. The assembly of Voyager had begun. But amid the celebrations, everyone knew they now had only 8 months before launch. The race to build big now accelerated. The challenge of turning design into reality had only just begun.
This TLC program is sponsored in part by new Kodak Max HQ one-time use flash camera.
I ran out of film.
created major structural problems for Harikulovara, but some of them were of his own making. It was he who had designed Voyager with a massive hole right in the middle of the structure. It's called the Royal Promenade.
There is quite a lot of structural problems to start with. We have a hole in the center of the ship, in the backbone. And this is just an empty hole. So from the structural point of view, so this is a nightmare.
To make sure the Royal Promenade did not fatally weaken the ship's structure, called for some clever engineering. While the street is 30 feet wide at the base, at the top, 4 decks above, it's narrower, which increases the rigidity of the whole structure. During 1998, the challenges kept on coming as the intricate operation of lifting and joining each giant hull section took place. Like the giant bulbous bow, designed to ensure the ship cut smoothly through the sea. As the ship grew, it pushed rapidly skywards and brought another vital engineering issue to the fore. The ship is 214 feet tall, taller than the U.S. Capitol dome. She's so tall, there's a risk the sea might capsize her.
One of the most critical things here is the stability of the ship and the weight of the ship. A ship like this floats, and it rides through the waves, and it needs to be stable. It needs to be stable so that it's comfortable for the passengers, but also it needs to be stable so that it can sustain any possible damage.
Compared to an oil tanker like the Yara Viking, which sits low in the water, less than 10% of the hull, only 26 feet, is submerged. Because of this, Voyager was potentially very unstable unless they could lower the center of gravity. To solve this problem, they had to abandon heavy steel and construct the entire top third of the ship out of lighter materials.
And that's why, for example, deck 11, where we are standing on, and everything up from here is built of aluminium. It's not load carrying anymore. The load is carried by the steel structure down below. We can actually see here, just behind us, that seam. That's the transition from steel to aluminium. And everything above that seam is now aluminium in order to provide the right lightweight and provide the low center of gravity for the ship.
Stability isn't just crucial in reducing the risk of capsizing. Well before that might happen, bad weather could still make for a rough voyage. It's possible to eat 15 meals a day on the ship, and the need for Voyager to remain steady is vital, not only for safety, but to avoid a boat full of seasick pleasure seekers.
All sign on. In front of crew office on deck 1.
Passenger comfort is the responsibility of ship's purser, Randy Johnson. Today is a Sunday, and like every Sunday since Voyager first arrived in Miami, it's a big day.
Sunday is one of our busiest days here on board the Voyager of the Seas. We pull in at 6 o'clock in the morning. We're expected to disembark 3,600 guests by about 9:30 this morning. Within 2 hours, starting at 11:30 in the morning, we'll be re-embarking another 3,600 guests. During that time, we're going to handle about close to 10,000 pieces of luggage. It's a massive movement of luggage.
In just 6 hours, the crew have to make sure the ship is loaded with all the passengers, their luggage, and all the food and drink they're going to consume.
I believe in any given day we are preparing close to 22,000 meals for the crew and the guests on board. That's on any given day. The entire day here in Miami is spent loading food and beverage provisions at the aft end of the ship. Just enormous quantities of Coke and beer, and it's an impressive sight to see how much food they go through.
22,000 meals a day averages out at 4 per person for everybody on board. And while overdoing it a little is what vacations are all about, allowing for the increased weight that all the portable items add to the ship, like tables, chairs, food, and passengers full of food, were a vital consideration for Harikulovara. One officer is even assigned to check the hull hasn't bent during loading.
He controls and checks that the ship has the right stability, we have the right payload on, and he also looks on that the ship's hull girder is not overly stressed anywhere and that it is straight.
Unaware of the lengths to which engineers have gone to prevent disaster, few passengers realize that Voyager has paid a price to be this tall and yet remain safely stable. If you build tall, regardless of whether you use lightweight materials or not, you have to build wide. At 128 feet, she's the widest passenger ship in the world. So wide, she can't even fit through the Panama Canal. She would have to sail right around the tip of South America if she wanted to reach the Pacific. But Royal Caribbean believes the demand for Caribbean cruises is so huge, she'll make plenty of money just endlessly circling the Caribbean. For the moment, their belief seems justified. Voyager's fully booked for months. And few seem worried where they're actually headed. Passengers have other concerns. For some, being allowed on the ship at all is the issue.
Just this afternoon outside on the pier, we have a 20-year-old young lady embarking with her 16-year-old husband, and we do have policies regarding age limits to guests that can sail minimum age, and these are one of the things that we come across and decisions that have to be made on whether or not those guests should be permitted to sail.
Was the decision for or against?
The decision was for them. They are, I believe, on their honeymoon, so we've created some happy honeymooners.
They'll honeymoon in a cabin like this, unaware that without the ingenious way in which it was built, it's doubtful whether the ship would have been finished on time. Back in Finland, by winter 1998, modular construction was now well advanced. Speeded on its way by the fact that every cabin had been prefabricated off-site before being loaded into the hull. The effect was to reduce the ship's assembly down to a mere 8 months. Thanks to modular construction like this, 300,000 components have been joined to create the mega superstructure. And at last, the ship was ready to launch. But again, traditional shipbuilding methods were ignored. Voyager wouldn't be sent down a ramp into the sea. Instead, the entire dry dock would be flooded for the ship to float free on her own. It was a key moment for the shipyard. And after the necessary ceremonial, the valve was opened so millions of tons of ice-cold Baltic seawater could pour into the dry dock. It would take hours to fill up before the ship could be floated out. And without her engines working, the ship would have to rely on tugboats to pull her 142,000 tons out of the dry dock. As they did this, everyone looked on, anxious that no lines snagged or snapped as they guided the giant into the sea for the first time. At last, Voyager was a reality, but this success seemed only to fulfill the desire to build mega ships among Royal Caribbean's rivals. In the final 9 months of the project, as schedules really began to bite, rivals began to stir themselves into action. A new design was being developed for a ship even bigger than Voyager that would bring back the golden age of sea travel.
Yeah, boys will be boys, and we like to have our toys. But we believe that in order to bring back the glory days of transatlantic cruising, it makes sense to make this ship big. Yeah, I like saying that the ship is bigger than the Voyager of the Seas. I like that because I'm like, you know, a macho guy.
The gloves were off, and the question became not when Voyager would be ready, but how long she would reign as the biggest cruise ship the world had ever seen.
This TLC program is sponsored in part by Mitsubishi Motors, the 2001 Eclipse. Wake up and drive.
Voyager hadn't won the race to build the biggest. She'd simply raised the stakes. Bill Lieber helped develop a rival for the world's most famous shipping line, Cunard, the company that owned the White Star Line, that operated Titanic and built the Queen Mary and QE2. Competing with Voyager is a matter of pride as well as business.
It's our birthright. We're Cunard. Samuel Cunard began this business in 1840 doing transatlantic travel, taking people from one place to another. That's what we want to do.
But that was then. This is now. And Cunard is taking the biggest risk yet in the cruise ship war. A return to the great days of the ocean liner with a brand new version of the Queen Mary.
The Queen Mary is going to be the largest ocean liner ever built. It's going to be 150,000 gross tons. Imagine the Empire State Building it laying on its side. It's going to be 100 feet longer than that.
It's not just history, but hard-headed business rivalry that's behind the new Queen Mary. In 1998, Cunard was bought by Carnival Cruise Lines, Royal Caribbean's great rival. This makes the Queen Mary Carnival's secret weapon in their attempt to outdo Voyager of the Seas.
Each one of us needs a gimmick. And anybody that tells you that they don't need a gimmick if they're in marketing is not really speaking the truth. Their gimmick is the wow factor. It's the summer blockbuster movie. Now what we're offering is a much more intellectual experience.
But to industry expert Tom Steighorst, Cunard's gimmick is romantic nostalgia for a ship that sank.
The project was conceived about the same time as the movie Titanic came out here in the United States, which was far more successful than anybody imagined. And it really seized the imagination of the designers of the Queen Mary. And they thought that this romance of the sea and this response that had been engendered by the movie could be translated into the cruise business.
Not everyone is convinced that the Queen Mary will be the success that Cunard and Carnival want. Tom has doubts about the highbrow sales pitch.
An intellectual enlightenment, is that what people go on a cruise for? This liner idea is a fairly limited concept in the cruise industry right now. And not everybody is certain that you can build a ship of this size with 3,000 or 4,000 passengers on it and have them go across the Atlantic Ocean with nothing to see for 6 days.
The jury is still out on Queen Mary, but while Cunard's scheme was being hatched in Miami, back in Finland, Voyager had other problems. They were now well into 1999, and there were just 6 months left to finish the ship. Speed was of the essence if they were to be ready for Miami's Christmas cruise bonanza. Attention had turned away from the superstructure to Voyager's revolutionary new steering and propulsion systems. The propellers are fixed to azipods, rotatable units which do away with the need for a rudder and drive shafts. This saves weight while making the ship more maneuverable, crucial when docking a vessel this big.
This ship is bigger. The ports are the same size as Stealth. They remain the same. The azipod propulsion system, to my mind, was almost a must for this project. I think I would not have recommended the company to go for this ship size with conventional propellers anymore.
To push Voyager through the water, the engines have to generate 42,000 kilowatts of electrical power. On the nerve center of the ship, the state-of-the-art bridge, there was now just a week to go before departure, and engineers were working round the clock, testing and calibrating the host of sophisticated control systems that will drive the azipods. The new ship's captain, Svein Pettersen, is also aboard. He's excited with his new charge, a technological marvel compared with the ships he's been sailing for years. Voyager is run by computers. There's not a ship's wheel in sight. In fact, the whole vessel can be controlled by the click of a mouse, situated in the armrest of the captain's chair.
Tracker ball is here, the left click and the right click, as if you operate your computer, whatever. And this is to change like the range on the radar or to change information on the voyage management system.
The voyage management system means the ship knows its location anywhere on the planet. And when the captain takes the helm, All he needs to steer her is this small joystick.
The joystick has 4 positions, so if you want the ship to go forward, you push forward. And the more you push, the faster the ship goes. This is very convenient to use when you are docking and undocking, because you don't have to do much of thinking. And in turning, you can alter the course.
Playing with the controls is one thing. Sailing her for real meant Svein Pedersen needed to get all the practice he could before sailing her across the Atlantic to Miami. Amazingly, he was able to do this without ever leaving land.
Okay, control ready.
In Fort Lauderdale, Brian Long and his team have built another Voyager bridge, replicating the real thing down to the smallest detail. But the simulator also replicates the world outside the ship. This is the virtual port of Miami, identical to the one Voyager will soon sail into. Even the helicopters which take off and land at the next door heliport are included.
There's really no environmental situation that we cannot simulate. We can actually go beyond reality. We can bring in hurricane forces, or bring in tremendous waves that will affect the ship.
When Voyager arrives in Miami, she'll have to turn 180 degrees in order to dock at the cruise terminal.
We're now in the turning basin, which is a critical maneuver for any captain coming into Miami. At this point, I'm going into azimuthing mode, which gives me the ability to maneuver each of the thrusters independently. At this point, I would turn inboard the 2 azipod levers. I'm going to thrust the starboard azipod, which will give me a force on my stern in this direction and create a rotation in a clockwise manner. Is this too slow? Yeah.
In 11 days' time, Voyager would be making this complex maneuver for real. Early one Sunday morning, a mere 20 months after the first section of hull was laid in the dry dock, Voyager began her journey to America. Now Captain Pedersen was at the helm for real.
You've never seen a Wagner power painter like this before. Now Wagner's innovative wide-shot power painter can spray today's thick one-coat paint better than ever.
This is Voyager, disconnect.
11 days after departing the building dock in Finland, just before dawn, Voyager lay just off the coast of Florida.
Okay, just checking. Yeah, we see you have the ladder rigged here on the port side.
Port of Miami pilot John Fernandez has the job of greeting the ship and guiding her into port.
Be there in a minute. It's a lot of fun to have a ship with all the toys that this one has. And the challenge is the sheer size of the ship, the length and the beam, getting it through a narrow channel and into the port safely.
Until John Fernandez is on the bridge, the final approach cannot be made.
Good morning. How are you doing, John?
The ship must sail up the channel before turning around in the turning bay. At this point, the Giant will have only 6.5 feet of clearance below its hull. A battle to build big. Ships that are taller than 23-story buildings, nearly 4 football fields in length, and too wide to fit through the Panama Canal. Cruise lines are stretching technology to its limits in a race to dwarf the competition with the ultimate super ship. November 1999, just off Florida's east coast, and maritime history is being made. Arriving at her home port of Miami for the very first time is the largest passenger vessel ever. She's called Voyager of the Seas. She's just sailed here from Finland, the country where she was built. After her epic maiden voyage across the North Atlantic, this is a nervous moment for ship's captain Svein Pedersen, as he comes to grips with the ship's brand new steering and navigation systems to negotiate the giant's way through the narrow shipping channels into her berth. Voyager of the Seas is a descendant of the great passenger liners like the Titanic, the Queen Mary, and the QE2. And Voyager is the 21st century's equivalent. Her voyage has followed in the footsteps of the famous old transatlantic liners. But that's where the similarities end. Because the $450 million spent on making her look like toys.
That's an incredible ship. It's beautiful, it's sleek, it's fast, but the Freedom Ship is an entirely different concept. It's an entirely different design. It's not designed to be a cruise ship. It's designed to be a community.
In the future, shipbuilding faces the prospect of becoming more like social engineering if Norman builds his dream. Norman's from Saratoga, Florida. He and his associates have rented an office in a suburban shopping center from where they hope to convince investors that their dream can be made into a reality.
It may be navigable.
And it's quite a dream.
Is it viable?
They're not really planning a ship. They're planning a city, a permanent home for 80,000 people. Freedom Ship will be more than 4 times longer and 5 times wider than Voyager. It will weigh 3 million tons and be more than a mile long. That's almost 5 times taller than the Empire State Building. But for Norman and his pals, the ship is more than engineering. Something this big is ultimately about the kind of world they want to live in.
It's an all-inclusive community that includes everything that you have in your local community. You've got a place to live. You've got a school system for your children that goes from kindergarten through college. It's a no-nonsense school system in which the teacher has control of the classroom, not the students. We're not going to have vagrants on the street. You know, unless you can afford a unit, you basically won't be there.
Skeptics doubt it'll float, either financially or in the sea. But in 1997, Voyager was also just a dream. On the bridge, final preparations are underway. In the hold, the last bags are loaded on. Passengers explore the facilities and crowd into the Royal Promenade. She's ready to leave. And there's only one thing left to do. After a final delay to let on late arrivals, at last the order was given to release her from her ties. The mega-powerful azipods began to push the ship away from the dockside, and the voyage begins. With Voyager, the age of the supership has begun. Replica ships have already been completed, and the cruising gold rush looks set to continue. That means that the crown she wears as the largest passenger ship in the world will be taken from her in due course, as soon as 2003, if the Queen Mary II is built. And it may be one day as we continue to push the limits, break the rules, and build the biggest. Voyager will be seen merely as a small milestone on the way to ships so huge, we'll live on them in the same way we live in cities today. If, of course, you have the money.